I got a really great question from a client today, and I thought it would be useful to do a recording of the question and then my response to it because it's come up in some interesting ways recently for me in my own exploration of modalities and approaches and styles and effectiveness when it comes to connecting with people and their pain, essentially. My client, I'm going to kind of condense it a little bit. She talks about Scott Kiloby's work and really looking at thoughts, feelings, sensations, that which creates a story of her. And then she talks about another teacher's approach of connecting or having compassion and nurturing oneself. So being with the story of her and being self-compassionate. She said, do I tend to myself with loving kindness and compassion, or do I not get involved in the thoughts and images that create the Susan? And she also says that, do I label the feelings? Do I label what's going on? So first I'd like to say that, of course, this is really going to be different for every person. And so it's why in my work with clients, I don't really strictly adhere to one modality. In general, the work that I do is umbrellaed under living inquiries, because for me the living inquiries is quite wide and depth and deep, I should say. But I also do shamanic work, I also do matrix work, I also do some other modalities that I've been doing long before I came across the living inquiries. And so those do weave in at times, just intuitively. And I do work intuitively. So I'll say that I think that that the living inquiries in Scott's work is rooted in compassion. I just want to say that first. And I don't want to speak for Scott, but I think he would agree with me that the reason he's actually shared this before, and I think even in his books, the reason he came to create the inquiries was from compassion, because he saw the people that he was meeting with suffer, and the non-dual approach that he had been versed in, so to speak, or had been engaged with in a satsang style, wasn't making an impact in ways that was satisfying for him. And so he compassionately created a method that would connect with people's experiences in a way that supported them and that helped them, so to speak, meet direct experience or meet their reality, or meet reality. And so first I just want to say that for me, the living inquiries it was birthed from compassion. However, in the living inquiries, we don't focus on compassion per se, and yet compassion arises. It's discovered, and it is, and it does arise on its own, really, as it's discovered, as reality per se is met, as opposed to this false illusion, reality imagined that causes us suffering. When we see through that, we experience the compassion directly. Having said that, there are other approaches that employ compassion more overtly. And the languaging often will include compassion, and the invitation will often kind of lead one toward that. And in my discovery, there's not a right or wrong approach. There's not one approach. One's not better than the other. They're different points of entry, so to speak, that each client is resting in. And there's different Different languaging is different for each person. I do tend to think that when there's a lot of trauma, and this is my bias, this is clearly my bias, when there's a lot of trauma, when the nervous system is really ramped up, it needs some compassion. It needs perhaps some overt compassion. And so in the work that I often do, compassion does overtly make its way in. I will purposefully introduce or reference even compassion in the journey that I'm engaging with clients, because in our culture, compassion is so buried, it's so deeply inaccessible for many of us that I just bring it in purposefully, and then the discoveries come from there. For other people, and but this really isn't black and white, it's so not based in trauma or particularities, but at other times we do just simply look at words, picture, sensations, and that's what is called for. And so sometimes compassion just naturally is discovered. It's stumbled upon, and it naturally arises, and a spaciousness is revealed, and the load is lightened, so to speak. And that happens simply through the direct looking into our experience. Again, words and pictures and sensations, and other times, there's some other journeying that we do alongside that, or that I do alongside that. And I actually tend to these days anyway, I'm really met by the profundity of compassion, and as well as the lacking of compassion in our culture and within most of us. Compassion is something that most of us, I don't know if I've actually met anybody who was raised compassionately, like from the get-go in every moment, most of us have experienced childhoods where our deepest pains were not met compassionately. And often our pains were either rejected or shamed or just ignored, which is the opposite of compassion. So compassion isn't changing or fixing. It's literally just being with and allowing. And that happening of compassion is very rare, rarely experienced, or rarely taught, I should say, in this culture, just because the way our culture is set up. Our culture is an avoidant culture. It's a fast-paced culture. It's also a pain-repressive culture and a pleasure-seeking and engaging culture. So when a culture prefers pleasure over pain, or diminishes pain, or numbs out pain, and hides from that through the exploitation of pleasure, or the compulsions of pleasure, there isn't a lot of room for just being with. There's not a lot of room for compassion, for allowance, because there's already been a moving away from allowance when the numbing starts to happen, when those aspirins and Tylenols are handed out in those early years. The minute you have an ache or pain, slowly but surely, the ways that we numb discomfort continue onward as we age, through food, through TV watching, through media, through sex, through alcohol, drugs, tobacco, gambling, and the list goes on. Working a lot of hours. I mean, it can be just about anything that we will employ to distract ourselves from discomfort. So in my experience, most of us have had to learn compassion. It's not just something that's been birthed organically. Now, some of us were raised to be compassionate for others, or at least have empathy for others. And the caregiver model is quite alive in our culture. It's often coming from identity, and in its own way, coming from a way to numb out one's own pain, and then to feel safe in the world by taking care of others. Again, the same issue is here, in the sense that there's still an inner lack of compassion. We still don't know how to be deeply compassionate with ourselves. So for me, in the work that I do with people, it does seem that we have to be introduced to it often and be taught in a certain way, or at least have compassion demonstrated or embodied or experienced directly in a certain way, so that the system can study that, can get to know that energy of compassion, and then to transfer that into one's own meeting of oneself. It seems to me that without this piece of compassion, which ultimately comes from presence, it's really hard to connect to our direct experience, because there's too much in the way. There's too many layers in the way of self-loathing, shame, fear, grief, anger. There's a lot of layers of perception, so to speak, a lot of layers of Velcro, of interpretation, of story, that keep us from being able to really meet direct experience. And so in my journeying with people, it really does seem to be a powerful move to connect with self-compassion. And in doing so, the looking starts to shift. So once there's an ability to have self-compassion, there's an ability to be present with oneself, then self-inquiry can really start, and really looking at words, pictures, and sensations, the bare essences of our experience, can be turned toward. But if our nervous systems are so amped up, and there's such anxiety in our systems, which is true for most of us in this culture, it's going to be really challenging to do that. And if it is, it can often be from a head place, not from an embodied place. And really, this work is about embodiment for me. So anything that's coming from the head, is not. It's not sustainable. It's not going to be lasting or really deeply impacting. So bringing in the compassion allows the nervous system to kind of relax a bit. Then we get to do direct looking. So that's a long answer to that question. The short answer is is both, and not either or. We can do and, which is great. And how that's going to happen is going to be really unique to each person. Each moment, even each time one does self-inquiry, it's to really see what's alive and what's needed, and to honor all of it. And that's also true when I sit down with each person. How that session goes is, of course, just so organic and based on what shows up. So I hope that was useful for more than just my client. It seems to be an important topic.